"Remove that religious symbol or face contempt of court," the judge ordered, pointing at the small silver cross visible beneath the Royal Guard's collar. Guard Sergeant Thomas Blake had maintained perfect silence through racist taunts, physical attacks, and every provocation imaginable during his service. But in that courtroom, he broke his silence with 7 words that made the judge's face drain of color. "Your Honor, you've just violated 3 laws." Before we witness how one guard's knowledge of the law turned a courtroom into a battlefield for religious freedom, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a rifle, it's knowing your rights. Now, let's see what happens when military discipline meets legal brilliance. The mahogany-paneled courtroom at Westminster Magistrates Court had seen thousands of cases, but nothing quite like this. Guard Sergeant Thomas Blake stood in the dock, his ceremonial uniform immaculate, despite having just finished an 8-hour shift at Buckingham Palace. At 34, he was one of the youngest guards to earn the Distinguished Service Medal, though the judge seemed unimpressed by the decorations adorning his scarlet tunic. Judge Harold Pemberton, a man whose reputation for strict interpretations of law was matched only by his disdain for what he called modern accommodations, peered over his wire-rimmed glasses with barely concealed irritation. The complaint had come from a tourist who'd photographed Blake adjusting his collar, inadvertently revealing the small silver cross he wore beneath his uniform, a gift from his dying grandmother, worn every day for the past 12 years. "Sergeant Blake," Pemberton began, his voice carrying the weight of predetermined judgment, "you stand accused of violating Queen's Regulations 1975, Section 847, which clearly states that no personal items, particularly those of religious nature, shall be displayed while in ceremonial uniform. How do you plead?" Blake remained at attention, his military bearing perfect. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge's eyebrows rose mockingly. "Not guilty?" When photographic evidence clearly shows the religious symbol, perhaps the military has lowered its standards for literacy as well as discipline. The court clerk, Mrs. Patricia Hughes, shifted uncomfortably at the judge's tone. She'd seen Pemberton's crusade against religious expressions in public service before, 6 cases in the last 3 months alone. Each guard had paid their fine and left, careers tarnished, faith questioned. "Your Honor," Blake spoke with measured precision, "I request permission to represent myself in this matter." Pemberton's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "A guardsman playing barrister? This should be entertaining. Very well, waste the court's time if you must, but know that the fine stands at £1,000 and contempt charges will add considerably more." Blake reached into his service bag and withdrew a leather-bound notebook, its pages marked with colorful tabs. The judge's smirk faltered slightly as Blake opened it to reveal dense handwritten notes, case citations, and photocopied legal documents. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I must inform the court that I've been recording these proceedings as permitted under Section 9 of the Criminal Justice Act 1967. "Recording?" Pemberton's voice rose. "On what authority?" "My own, sir. As a defendant representing himself, I have the right to maintain accurate records for potential appeal." Blake's voice remained steady, professional. "Additionally, I've filed notice with the Crown Prosecution Service of my intent to challenge the constitutionality of this proceeding." The courtroom, sparse with only a few observers, suddenly felt charged with electricity. Mrs. Hughes stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. Pemberton's face flushed. "Sergeant Blake, you will remove that religious symbol immediately or face contempt charges. This court will not tolerate." "Your Honor, you've just violated 3 laws." The 7 words hung in the air like a challenge. Pemberton's face went from red to pale in seconds. Blake continued, his voice gaining strength. "First, Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights, incorporated into British law through the Human Rights Act 1998, guarantees freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This includes the right to manifest religion through wearing of religious symbols." "That's," Pemberton started. "Second," Blake interrupted, "something that would have been unthinkable from a guard under normal circumstances. The Equality Act 2010, Section 10, specifically protects against discrimination based on religion or belief in public functions. By singling out my cross while ignoring the St. Christopher's medal worn by the court officer to your left, you've demonstrated discriminatory enforcement." All eyes turned to the court officer, who reflexively touched his collar where indeed a small medal was visible. "Third," Blake pressed on, "the Armed Forces Act 2006, Section 334, supersedes the Queen's regulations you cited when it comes to matters of religious expression. It states that service members may wear religious items provided they don't interfere with operational effectiveness or safety. A small cross worn under my uniform meets these criteria. Pemberton's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. In 23 years on the bench, he'd never been challenged like this. Certainly not by someone he'd dismissed as a decorative soldier. Furthermore, Blake opened his notebook to a marked page. I present to the court the case of Uida Vrief British Airways, where the European Court of Human Rights ruled that preventing the wearing of religious symbols constitutes a violation of Article 9. The ruling specifically mentions that visible crosses are protected expression. Sergeant Blake, Pemberton found his voice, though it lacked its earlier authority. You seem to forget that military regulations. Actually, Your Honor, I've served for 14 years, completed 2 tours in Afghanistan, and spent the last 3 years studying law through the Open University. I'm 6 months from completing my LLB. Blake's revelation sent another ripple through the courtroom. I'm quite familiar with military regulations. The judge gripped his gavel but didn't bang it. Studying law doesn't make you a barrister, Sergeant? No, sir, but it does make me aware of judicial misconduct when I see it. Blake turned to another section of his notebook. Would you like me to read from the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office report from last month? The one where you were warned about religious bias after dismissing a Sikh officer's discrimination claim? Mrs. Hughes gasped audibly. This was public record, but barely anyone knew about it. Pemberton's knuckles whitened as he gripped the bench. How dare you? Or perhaps, Blake continued, his voice never losing its military precision, we should discuss the pattern of your rulings. 14 cases involving religious symbols in the past 6 months. All guilty verdicts, all involving Christian or Jewish symbols. Yet, curiously, no cases involving other faiths have come before your court. Sergeant Blake, you are in contempt. Am I, Your Honor? Or are you? Blake pulled out another document. Because I have here a petition signed by those 14 service members, filed yesterday with the Lord Chief Justice, requesting a formal investigation into your conduct. They were afraid to speak up individually, but together. The courtroom door opened, and a man in an expensive suit entered. Your Honor, forgive the interruption. I'm James Crawford, QC, representing Sergeant Blake. Pemberton's face went from pale to ashen. Crawford was one of London's most prominent human rights barristers. Mr. Crawford, the judge stammered, your client didn't mention representation. He didn't need to, Your Honor. He's been handling himself admirably. I'm here merely to observe and, if necessary, to file immediate papers with the High Court. Crawford's smile was sharp. Please, don't let me interrupt. I believe Sergeant Blake was explaining your legal violations. Blake stood straighter, if that was possible. Your Honor, I've prepared a formal complaint to be filed with the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office. However, I'm willing to withdraw it under certain conditions. Conditions? Pemberton's voice cracked. You dare negotiate with this court? I dare to demand justice, sir. Not just for myself, but for every service member you've targeted. Blake's voice carried the authority of someone who'd led men in combat. Here are my terms. First, all 14 fines are to be reversed and refunded with interest. Second, a public apology to be published in the London Gazette. Third, you will recuse yourself from any future cases involving religious expression. The courtroom held its breath. Crawford nodded approvingly, but remained silent. And if I refuse? Pemberton asked, though his voice lacked conviction. Then Mr. Crawford files our application with the High Court in... Blake checked his watch. 43 minutes. We've already prepared a press release detailing your pattern of discrimination. The Guardian has expressed particular interest. Mrs. Hughes had stopped pretending to type, watching the drama unfold with undisguised fascination. Pemberton looked around the courtroom as if seeking an escape route. Finding none, he straightened his robes. This is blackmail. No, Your Honor, Blake replied calmly. Blackmail would be if I threatened to reveal something criminal. I'm simply offering you the chance to correct your mistakes before they become public record. The same chance you denied those 14 service members. Crawford finally spoke. Your Honor, my client's terms are remarkably generous considering the circumstances. The alternative is a very public judicial review that will examine every one of your religious discrimination cases. I should mention that 3 national newspapers have reporters waiting outside. The silence stretched for long moments. Finally, Pemberton's shoulders sagged. Case dismissed. All charges against Sergeant Blake are dropped. And the other terms? Blake pressed. I need time to consider. Respectfully, Your Honor, you've had 6 months of targeting service members. You have 10 minutes to decide. Blake's tone brooked no argument. Pemberton's gaze darted between Blake, Crawford, and the door where reporters apparently waited. Fine, I agree to your terms. All of them. In writing, Your Honor. Crawford produced a prepared document. My client anticipated your cooperation. As Pemberton signed with a shaking hand, Blake felt no triumph, only relief. This wasn't about winning. It was about justice for those who couldn't fight back. 20 minutes later, Blake emerged from the courthouse to find the 14 service members he'd been secretly organizing for months. They stood in formation, a mix of guards, naval personnel, and RAF officers, each wearing their religious symbols proudly. "Did we win, Sarge?" asked Corporal Sarah Miller, her Star of David gleaming in the afternoon sun. "We all won," Blake replied, his cross now visible above his collar. "Every person who believes in religious freedom won today." Crawford joined them, briefcase in hand. "Sergeant Blake, have you considered a career change after your military service? You'd make an formidable barrister." Blake smiled, the first break in his military bearing all day. "Thank you, sir, but I have 6 months left on my law degree, and then a training contract with your chambers, if the offer still stands." Crawford laughed. "After what I witnessed today?" The offers increased by 20%. The next morning, every major newspaper carried the story. "Guard's legal brilliance exposes biased judge," read the Times. The Guardian's headline was more direct. "Silent Guardian finds his voice, saves religious freedom." Within a week, the Lord Chief Justice announced new guidelines protecting religious expression in public service. The Blake Protocols, as they became known, ensured that no judge could systematically target service members' faith. Judge Pemberton took early retirement, his reputation in tatters. The 14 service members received their refunds along with formal apologies. Several went on to become advocates for religious freedom in the armed forces. But the most lasting impact was on Blake himself. He completed his law degree with first-class honors and specialized in human rights law. His chambers became known as the firm that guards the guardians, representing service members facing discrimination. Years later, when asked about that day in court, Blake would say, "I spent years maintaining silence as a guard, but I learned that sometimes breaking your silence is the most honorable thing you can do. 7 words changed everything, not because they were clever, but because they were true." His cross still hangs visible above his collar, now complemented by his barrister's bands. In his office hangs a frame with those 7 words. "Your Honor, you've just violated 3 laws." Below it, signatures from 14 grateful service members and one simple message. "Thank you for teaching us that knowledge is the greatest weapon against injustice." The guard who once stood silent had found his voice, and with it, he gave voice to those who had been silenced. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with words, and sometimes the most powerful warrior is the one who knows exactly when to speak. Because in that courtroom, when religious freedom met legal prejudice, justice found its champion in an unlikely place. A guard trained to be silent who knew exactly when to roar. What would you do if authority tried to strip away your fundamental rights? Would you have the courage and knowledge to fight back like Thomas Blake? This story reminds us that education is the great equalizer, and that standing up for our rights requires both courage and preparation. If Blake's legal brilliance inspired you, share this video with someone who needs to know their rights matter. Like this video if you believe religious freedom deserves protection, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of guards who protect more than just palaces. They protect principles. Hit that notification bell to join our community of 500,000 viewers who believe knowledge is power and justice is worth fighting for. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to stand up for your religious rights? What gave you the courage to speak up? We read every story and feature the most powerful ones. Remember, silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is break your silence. See you next week with another extraordinary tale of courage, conviction, and the power of knowing your rights.